We are joined by State Representative John Bucy, who serves on the House Elections Committee. Quite a marathon hearing. You heard from many people on both sides of the bill. Did the people who came out to speak in person make a difference in the outcome at this point?
I really think so. We had 22 hours. This was the second week in a row that people came out to testify on House Bill 6. They wanted to make sure their voice was heard. There's a lot of deep concern from all over Texas about this bill. It's going to make it harder for people to vote, especially individuals with a disability, individuals who their English is not their first language, and our friends in the Black and brown community. And so people came out to make sure that we didn't pass this bill. They wanted to know that this will make it harder for them, and we shouldn't be passing legislation to make it harder for people of Texas to vote.
What are your biggest concerns with the bill right now?
You know, Ultimately, my number one concern with House Bill 6 is the new provisions about assisting someone in voting, whether it's the ballot by mail process or in person. There's new provisions if this bill was to pass for assistance. We heard from our election clerks yesterday that said that if this bill passes, they will end up throwing more ballots out in the ballot by mail process, because currently you would check a box that you had an assistant, but there's also going to be a new form that has to be included. So the simple act of honestly checking the box that you used assistance in your ballot by mail, but forgetting to include that new form, the result, as we heard yesterday in testimony from the experts, is that ballot would be thrown out, and those Texans who made that honest mistake would be disenfranchised from their right to vote. So that's my number one concern. There's a lot of threatening language in here about poll watchers. We're not talking about getting rid of poll watchers, but what this does is it says we no longer, our election judges would have the authority to throw out a poll watcher for harassment, for yelling, or doing things that wouldn't raise to a criminal level, but would obviously get in the way of the voting process. So that's deeply concerning. And then we see increased penalties across the board, making so much around the election process now felonies. And I think the only reason that we see that being done here is to intimidate people from participating in the process. So I asked the Attorney General's office yesterday, do you need these increased penalties? And he said that in 15 they fought for increased penalties, but they didn't need them anything new this time to get what they needed. And you can go back and check our testimony on that. But going back and forth with him, there was no need from their office for these increased penalties. So this is being done as an intimidation factor.
Republicans say this is about election integrity, keeping people from cheating, and polls have shown that that's a big concern for GOP voters. How do you think lawmakers should address those specific concerns about cheating?
Well, I would first reference back to our first elections committee hearing of this session when Keith Ingram with the Secretary of State said that our elections in Texas in 2020 were safe and secure. So I'm not sure what problem they're trying to solve based on the words of the Secretary of State's office. I think if we truly want safe and secure elections, the best way to do that is through modernization. Online voter registration is more accurate, it's more safe, and it's more secure. We have great legislation to make online voter registration available for everyone in Texas, and that's the true first step to increasing security in our election process.
Representative, this week's hearing was a do-over after last week's attempt to hold a hearing on this bill. Can you walk us through the issues there, and then the moment where the chair gave the gavel to another Republican instead of the Democratic vice chair? What's going on here with that?
Sure. Last week, sadly, the chair refused to allow other members of the Texas legislature who had requested a seat at the dais to participate. This is not an uncommon practice. It's not always every day that you see other members sit down, but it happens. It happened last session in elections, where in this case, the Legislative Black Caucus had asked to have representation for this hearing, and so did Mexican American Legislative Caucus. They were denied that for full participation last session. That led to the vice chair trying to recognize one of those individuals. And then ultimately the chair kind of being angered by that action, fumbled us into what would have been a point of order and had to cancel the hearing last session by the way that the individual took a recess. So that's what happened last week. I think because of that, the chair chose not to pass the gavel back to the vice chair. It's the traditional precedent to do that. So although it's not a requirement, it was disappointing. It's not how we do things in the legislature. We try to do these, most things in a bipartisan manner. And so we really saw a deviation from the norms by not trusting the vice chair to have the gavel and conduct the hearing while the chair was laying out the bill yesterday.
What does that say about the status of this bill? What does that say about the intensity that is coming from both sides on this issue?
Sure. I think what it shows is that this is a very intense legislative session when it comes to the fight for voting rights. We're seeing the Republican Party put forward legislation without any need for this, as we've heard over and over from the Secretary of State and the Office of the Attorney General. There's not a need to increase these penalties. There's not a need to solve a problem that doesn't exist, but I think it's being used as a political tactic to hold on to power. And the Democrats see it, and we're deeply concerned about legislation that is being put forward to make it harder for individuals in the state of Texas to vote. So it's going to be very controversial. We're going to, because of that, we're not going to back down in our fight to stop House Bill 6 and SB 7, which is going to infringe on voting rights. And I fear the Republicans aren't going to stop in their pursuit to infringe on those rights either. So it's a testament to how controversial these bills are, and unfortunately, if they come into law, how terrible they'll be for so many people to have access to the ballot box.
We know that there are differences of opinion on both sides of the aisle on this, clearly. Ultimately, both chambers are controlled by Republicans. The governor is a Republican. Assuming that something passes here, what's next for election legislation? Is there a place for room to work together on both sides to find some common ground?
I would say there absolutely is. One of the things that bill I have that we've already heard in committee is a ballot by mail tracker. So it's so individuals that are voting by mail can monitor the status of their ballot, whether their application has gone out, come back in. We're seeing bipartisan support. Republicans have filed similar bills. We're seeing some of this language in some of this other legislation. And what it shows me is if we can move towards modernization and streamlining the process, it creates safety, security, and access by using technology and modernization. So I think that is the path forward. I think that's where we can truly find some bipartisan progress. So we need this ballot by mail tracker. Then ultimately we need online voter registration, and that solves both of the stated goals of ballot access and ballot security.
Opponents of the election bills are getting support from big business in this.
Yeah.
Dell, Microsoft, American Airlines, all issuing statements against voting restrictions. Why do you think these businesses are weighing in right now? And do you think that will make a difference?
I think it absolutely will make a difference. We saw, in fact, former Republican Speaker Strauss speak up against these bills as well. What we're seeing is the business community is coming to the aid of the people of Texas because it's their employees that live here, work here, and vote here, and they want to make sure that their employees don't lose the right to the ballot box either. And that's what HB 6 and SB 7 will ultimately do, is cut down on people's access. So I think big business speaking up is vital in a state that relies on big business. We need their voice. We need more big business to speak up. If we don't have the votes alone as Democrats to stop this legislation, we rely on the people of Texas showing up, and that includes our business partners that call Texas home. And so I'm greatly encouraged by Dell and AT&T and American Airlines and the many others that have spoken up, and I just hope more will join them. This legislation is bad for Texas. It's bad for the people of Texas. It's bad for their employees, and we need to stop it. And so I'm greatly encouraged by them joining us in this fight.
State Representative John Bucy, thank you very much for the time.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.